Hi everyone, welcome to Brick and Block, and I am very excited to introduce my final guest for season 1, Peter Oborn. Hi Peter.
Hi.
Now we've done a lot of conversations over the podcast series, and what I'm particularly excited about this episode is that we will be looking at things in a macro scale. Up until now, it's been very succinct and we've looked at specific areas. So I'm very, very excited to chat to you, Peter, today. But for those who don't know you, you've been in the industry for a very long time at Aedas, I believe.
That's right.
For a long time. And since then, you've also been doing a lot of work with various organisations, RIBA, CAA, etc. Would you mind doing a quick little intro to yourself?
Okay, so I'll try and condense 40 years of practice into 5 minutes. But let me start by thanking you for inviting me to have this conversation. And
no, thank you.
Okay, so I mean, I followed the same path as most graduates when I qualified. I went and did my practical training, but I'd been studying and working in Edinburgh, and I was quite keen to travel a bit, and so I was very keen to work overseas. And I found myself working for a Scottish practice in a place called the Sultanate of Oman, which sounded very elaborate and romantic.
Exotic.
Exactly, exotic. So there I was as a young trainee architect on the eastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, and I felt as if I'd landed on the moon, frankly, because it was the late 70s and the beginnings of the oil boom, and they were beginning to develop a new town there called Rui. And honestly, I felt as if I landed on the moon. I couldn't really correlate what I was seeing with what I had been taught, all around sustainability and appropriate design and passive design and such, like curtain wall buildings and no public transport and anyway, so I went there with a sort of fairly inquisitive mind and made it the subject of a master's, which came back to kind of haunt me later in my career, and maybe touch on that later. But spent several years then in the Gulf, working in different countries before coming back to the UK, where I was invited to open an office for a provincial practice. And where I worked for 30 years, growing a practice in London. And part of that growth involved trying to differentiate ourselves from others. So we created an R&D group, which had sort of specialisms in sustainability, advanced modeling and computational design. And a lot of the work we were doing there was very much open source, because we were trying to drive change throughout the industry as well. And one of the projects that we were involved with was something called Carbon Buzz, which in those days was an attempt to evidence the performance gap, which we all now recognize the difference between design and operational energy. And I approached the RIBA, a colleague at the RIBA, to see if they could help us promote this platform. And what I discovered at the RIBA, because like most people, I'd spent most of my career pretty much ignoring the institute, didn't think it was really very relevant. But what I found was a treasure trove, frankly. And the RIBA helped us promote this platform. And I became drawn into the institute and ended up standing for election and was elected, and found myself serving as international vice president. And through that role came to learn really, of the esteem in which the institute is held, and of the important role it has to play in helping those grappling with some of the global challenges that we're all now familiar with. And so and that ultimately lured me into a conversation with what was then the Department for International Development, with UN Habitat, and into this greater awareness of the role of the professions in bridging that gap between policy and practice. As a consequence of that, we came together to launch something called the UK Built Environment Advisory Group, which is basically a collaboration between the RIBA, the RTPI, the IStructE, and the Landscape Institute, which in turn led to a contract with the Foreign Office to deliver something called the Global Future Cities Programme, which was actually an £80 million programme aimed at supporting 30 projects in 19 cities in 10 countries throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. And so I kind of found myself in this space, which was very much removed from traditional architectural practice, but really using design thinking to engage with global challenges. And I've become a great advocate, for architects working in that space now. And I no longer work in traditional architectural practice. So my contribution is now in this area. And I'm happy to speak more about that as we move through this conversation.
You mentioned the R&D element that you worked on previously, which I have a question on that in a minute, but because you were already perhaps collaborating and interacting with the RIBA and others, did you find that as you moved away from professional practice into sort of advisory and sort of policy making, sort of guidance, was that quite a smooth transition, do you think, for your career, sort of moving on to a different sort of role?
Yeah, I think it was a natural evolution. And I wouldn't say I moved away from professional practice. I'd say I moved away from
Yeah,
traditional practice.
traditional practice. Yeah,
I think that, unfortunately, I think traditional practice has become quite narrowly defined, and I think the role of
yeah,
architects is potentially much broader. I think the way in which we can use our skills is much more broader than just the RIBA plan of work.
yeah.
Um, but no, it felt like a fairly natural evolution, actually. And ironically, one of the other projects that came to us at the RIBA while I was there was we were approached by the government of Oman, quite out of the blue. I said I started my career in Oman, and
Mm.
actually what they wanted help with was tackling some of the built environment challenges that had arisen over the course of the intervening 20 to 30 years, and they commissioned us to undertake an RIBA competition to find a master planner for the replacement of the city that I had found myself working in all those years ago. So there was
Right.
a certain irony that I ended up writing the brief for the city that replaced the place I'd started working in. But it was a sweet irony, of course, and but it also allowed me to see that the institute had the
Mm.
potential for engaging with sovereign governments, and so this UK Built Environment Advisory Group was very much designed to engage with sovereign governments and development partners who are dealing with these challenges, which are just the same challenges that we're dealing with in our everyday lives, but they're just the scale is different. So it's not an unnatural transition.
Yeah. Do you think, because obviously we'll touch on the Commonwealth, but because do you think with the Royal Institute of British Architects that because we have such a presence across many countries, and there are other countries that have architectural programs that are RIBA accredited, do you think that provides a sort of a presence that, say such a place like Oman, which, it's not really part of the Commonwealth, but they will look to the RIBA compared to, say, not to discredit the American Institute of Architects in any way, but compared to the AIA, they'll just go, oh, actually, there's a bigger presence in that sense.
I don't think there's any doubt that the RIBA and the AIA, pardon me, are the dominant players in the market in terms of their international engagement, and that's obviously partly from historical reasons, but also just
Yeah.
because of their scale and their size. I really was very struck, genuinely struck by the real interest in the work that the RIBA does around standards and tools of all sorts, and how we deal with government and such like. So, no, there's an untapped opportunity there in my view for the institute to continue to do more of this type of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think until we have been discussing recently, I wasn't actually, to be fair, aware so much that the RIBA had a presence outside of the UK as much as you had explained to me, and the partnerships that we've created with other sovereign states, that actually they will take our learnings and lessons that perhaps that we've seen over the years. And you're right, the challenge that every country and every city has are very much the same.
Yeah.
Do you think in that regard that sustainability is very much the same? Yes, environmentally we have different locations around the world, Oman much hotter than what we have in the UK, but sustainable principles are actually consistent.
Yeah, well, I mean, sustainability, obviously, as you say, Pradham, is very context specific, but the underlying rules, if you like, are universal. And I would say that when we talk about working with other countries and other professionals, some might interpret that as being potentially kind of a little bit patronizing. We're promoting best practice. Actually, I think most of the time what we're doing is telling people of the mistakes that we've made, so that they can avoid making the mistakes that we've made. Because God knows we've made enough of them.
Absolutely.
And so the learning is very much two ways. And there are many countries out there that are still adopting passive systems and natural materials that we can learn from too. So it's definitely a two-way street.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got a project in the office right now, which probably back in the day was probably lauded as amazing. They had this concrete external wall frame which bridged external to internal. So right now, massive coal bridge. Back in the day, probably fine. They probably didn't bat an eyelid about it. But, when in this day and age, when we're thinking about efficiencies, U values, the efficiencies of your heating and cooling system, that cold bridge probably, when it was done back in the 50s, 60s, it's probably fine, single glazed units, windows. But now when we want to, get a good EPC, think about neighbors, whatever, terrible design. It just doesn't work.
Exactly.
And now we're having to think about, the detailing around the columns, do we add aerogel? Do we, how do we remove the windows and double glazed units? Think about the detailing. If we had thought about that 50 years ago, wouldn't have had this issue. But, we do have those. And I think those are definite lessons.
Yeah. I mean, but when you scale that up on a city scale and think about integrated planning, we all know the mistakes that have been made in the States, for example, around, the reliance on the car, for example. If you bake that into the fabric of a city from the outset, you're really on a hiding to nothing. So, these basic principles are so vital, particularly for rapidly urbanizing countries.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you take any of the amazing work that Scandinavia does with public transport and pedestrianization, I mean, you're absolutely right. I guess it's not so much about patronization. It's just going, look, these are brilliantly they work so well, and you want to be pulling them through. I remember at university looking at Scandinavia so much for master planning. They just do such a great job of infrastructure and doing something so positive.
And what we've learned around nature-based solutions, for example, more recently,
exactly,
that's become a much more prominent part of our vocabulary, and it's so important in terms of dealing with climate change. Fundamental.
Do you think that, I'm not trying to pick on Oman here, but obviously with your experience there, do you think that when it comes to, say, biodiversity, it's weather-wise just a completely different climate? Do you think they're trying to make efforts with biodiversity in places like that, where it's a lot harder?
It is a lot harder, but it's still very much possible. In redesigning the city that I was talking about earlier, one of the fundamentals of the brief was to work with nature in all its forms. And when you look at the vernacular architecture of Oman, for example, it is absolutely beautiful. It's so well adapted to its climate. It's been adapted over centuries, and they have an rich agricultural system. It doesn't work everywhere because not everywhere is suitable for it. But where it does work, it is absolutely splendid. And they have, techniques for managing water, for bringing water from the mountains with a foliage system, irrigation systems, plant species, that are adapted. It's simply a matter of understanding the context, and that's always the key, of course, to really understand the places in which you're working.
Absolutely. One of the things that we had talked about recently was how, I guess, the world has developed, and urbanization, I guess, quite frankly, it's not been common, has it, in terms of every country growing at the same rate? That's quite evident. There are countries, if we call it the global north, then have, America, Europe, have progressed very rapidly over the years. Whereas global south, shall we say, has not as much. And they've got their own challenges, whether it's economical, whether there's past history. And in your report, the Horizons report, you sort of pick up on this. Obviously, through no fault of their own, this is the situation that we're in. And, history has its reasons for why it's happened. But where can we in the north, in Europe, in America, help other countries where they're trying to, obviously we talked about lessons, but sort of, is it just about sharing our lessons, or do you think we can do more to assist, those countries better, that they're trying to grow in the right way, I guess?
Well, I think underpinning your question, as you've sort of acknowledged, is the fact that the nature of the growth or the nature of the urbanization that's taking place, and let's call it the global north and the global south for the sake of wanting to find a phrase for this conversation.
A phrase,
yeah. questionable though they are. Yeah, so I mean, the way in which the global north has urbanized has been on the back of the Industrial Revolution, frankly. It's been largely the result of the Industrial Revolution, which has brought people into cities, to seek employment, as a consequence of which, through invention and discovery, cities have grown and prospered. I mean, obviously, there's been an element of exploitation there too in terms of the global trade, but unfortunately, the nature of urbanization in the global south has not followed that trend. It's tended to be more people moving from rural areas to cities in search of employment, which frankly, in many cases, isn't there. So, levels of informality, and they've overwhelmed local governments in many cases, so local governments have not been able to cope with that growth, which has resulted in what we see as high levels of informality. So the characteristics are fundamentally different, but that doesn't mean that the solutions aren't similar in some respects. And one has to be very careful here about, again, context is very different from one country to another. And the principles of urban planning are not dissimilar, as I've said, from one place to another. But what we've discovered through our work in the Commonwealth in particular is the challenges that are being faced in terms of scale and lack of capacity. So, if I give you an example of Uganda, a country of 45 million urbanizing at between 5 and 6% per annum, compared with the UK population of about 65 million urbanizing at less than 1% per annum. So, it's urbanizing incredibly quickly. And yet when we look at the number of built environment professionals that there are to support that growth, we find that, there are probably barely 300 architects in the whole country, all based in Kampala. So there's a real critical lack of capacity, particularly in the public sector, particularly in secondary cities. And there's a similar thing with education. There's 2 schools of architecture compared with our 65. So, even if replacing, growing the profession alone was the answer, which of course it isn't, it wouldn't be possible because the numbers just aren't there. And then the third thing is the built environment policy in terms of planning policy and building code. Again, the bulk of our respondents told us that, firstly, most of their codes aren't fit for purpose, but more importantly, they're not being implemented effectively. So there's the ecosystem is incredible. It's just so very different. And so can we help? Yes, of course we can help. There's a lot we can do. And as I say, much of it is around building capacity on the one hand, but the other is, helping them avoid making the mistakes that we have. So that's the work that we're now engaged with through the Commonwealth Association of Architects in particular.
It's very interesting you say this. So my father-in-law, he's now retired as of a few months, but he was part of the local municipal corporation of the state in India, and he's had various roles in the corporation. But he's sort of travelled various places. One of them was to Switzerland to understand waste management, and for a ridiculously growing population such as India, and obviously he's specifically looking at his own city himself, in Guntur, that waste management has been a massive conversation for them. And inherently, they will do some great stuff, but there's also, a rapid growth of population. So you just got so much stuff to deal with. And they went to Switzerland to understand how they do it. And obviously, different population, different things. But in terms of waste is waste to some level. And one of the things that they made a big effort with was the whole recycling side of things. And I think you're right. There's lessons that you can learn from different cities. And I think what's great, if the RIBA and other organizations do share the sort of technological advancements that you can do with certain things. But then when you combine that knowledge, I think, with the local sort of vernacular conversations, then I think you can take some principles and do it. But I think what my father-in-law was explaining to me was, you've got to implement those policies, and he was saying that it's a big struggle to educate and instill the principles, and it's taken time. I mean, he's been in that corporation for sort of 30 to 40 years, and it was a learning experience. Now they've got some fantastic policies. They're really pushing it on. The city of Guntur in the state of Andhra Pradesh is become one of the big cities in that state now. They've got a massive influx of people coming to study there, to live there, to work there, and there's a big migration even within India. Sort of people from the north coming to the south. And the south is generally booming a lot more than the north, with the exception of Mumbai and Delhi. So there's a big influx of population, sort of similar to what you were saying, where a lot of people are moving away from the rural areas, wherever that might be in the world, and coming to the cities in search for employment. But there's not necessarily always employment, so they've got those big challenges. And I think you're right about the education. One thing that he was also saying to me was that the government has been also trying, I think, to encourage people back. So if they've gone abroad to study, making sure they encourage the students back into the country. And I think that's a big thing. India's got a lot of population that have migrated abroad,
Exactly.
me being one of them, to live elsewhere. And I think it's trying to retain that talent as well, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned, I think, Uganda, right? So, there's lots of people studying there, but I think to go somewhere else or wherever it might be to study, to bring those principles back, people from Uganda, they're the best people to understand how to design and manage their cities more than what, you and I could.
For sure. And I can tell you now that whilst there may be only 300 architects or so in Uganda, they're a very feisty lot, and
Exactly.
yeah, they're incredibly committed to their profession. And but there is another paradox, unfortunately, because not only do we have this lack of capacity in places like Uganda, but we also have a lack of demand. So architects find it hard to get work, even in Uganda. You would think that with those figures and those ratios that I've quoted, that they would be falling over themselves, for work. But actually, it's a trouble because people don't understand the role of the architect. And so, also, explaining and advocating for the role of design and the importance of good planning, for example, are also incredibly important. And that's why, again, at the CAA, our three kind of core focus areas are advocacy, capacity building, and climate action. And I just want to say that whilst we as architects have got a huge role to play in this context, cities are very complex, and we can't do it all on our own. So what we also need to do, we talk about working across disciplines here in the UK, about working with engineers more closely and stuff like that. But actually, we need to get out of our comfort zone and work with others, economists, lawyers, government officials and such like. And that's why, again, in the Commonwealth context, we formed this collaboration between the Commonwealth Association of Architects, the Commonwealth Association of Planners, the Association of Commonwealth Universities, because academia is really important, and the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, to basically launch a call to action to heads of government to say, you really need to put a little bit more focus on this area because it's really important. And we've been quite successful in encouraging heads of government to adopt the Declaration on Sustainable Urbanisation in the Commonwealth. And now I think, are beginning to kind of convince policymakers of the need to engage with the topic more effectively. And I hope in going forwards, with us more effectively, because, cities are complex and slow, and we can only resolve these issues if we work on them together. So it's very much a collective effort, and it's a question of taking design thinking, from beyond the coal bridging and applying it to city scale. It's just the same kind of process, as we know, but it's also engaging policymakers in that process too, so that we can begin to accelerate the scale and speed of change that we need to push, the improvements that we all know we need to make.
No, I absolutely agree. We've, in the office, we've got a couple of people, obviously within the UK, sort of trying to join various, whether it's Architects Declare, or I've been part of the Letty group.
Great example.
So
fantastic example. Yeah,
they're absolutely fantastic, and I'm just a small part of it. But even if it's looking at commercial retrofit guidance that we're working on, it's funny that probably sort of, certainly when I came into the industry sort of a decade ago, none of this was really sort of there. It was sort of like a couple of organizations sort of doing stuff, but I mean, there's obviously been a big effort in the last couple of years from the likes of Letty, UKGBC, the GLA have been pushing their policies as well. That it's a collective effort to push those things. And I think you're right. Whether wherever the city is or wherever the place is, we've got to try and implement those as much as possible. But I think enforcement is probably another thing that, that certain cities and places do struggle with. And it's hard when you need to implement some principles in place, whether it's, water management, as you mentioned, or whether it's introducing enough biodiversity. There's a big thing in India right now where they've realized their mistake of, pure urbanization and giving the car so much relevance. Some of their cities just not built for that, tight roads. And so, you've got wider roads being, made way, but then they're trying to balance that with a bit of biodiversity and that. So I think it's really tough, really, really tough to sort of do it. Even in the street that my grandparents live, they've lost all the trees and they're trying to put them back in again because they realize all that heat's coming through.
Exactly.
So that's I think the policy side of things is really interesting. You obviously mentioned the CAA and I think all the fantastic work that they've been doing. Do you think the Commonwealth has got a massive array of countries. I mean, there's a vast amount of knowledge there. Is there reports and policies that you think that the CAA, in partnership with some of these other organizations that you mentioned, are wanting to and will sort of drive through the learnings of that sort of research?
Definitely. I mean, I think going back to my earlier point about this call to action and the fact that we've joined forces with other groups, one of the other groups we've joined forces with, for example, is the Commonwealth Lawyers Association to tackle this issue of ineffective legislation. And working with UN Habitat, we've just published, well, actually, we're in the process of publishing a legal checklist for cities. So in a way, it goes back to your Letty example, I think, the fact that sometimes some of these problems can seem so large that we all become victims. And actually, I think, what you've illustrated with the Letty example is the fact that, there's always more that each of us can do. And I would never have expected to find myself in the position that I'm in now, 30, 40 years ago, where one's working with a UN agency helping to produce global guidance on, these sorts of topics. But there's a huge scope for people to contribute to this work if they're interested in doing so. And there's a tremendous need. Can I just quote one statistic at you, which I think I've shared with you before, which is quite shocking, which is that when we look across the Commonwealth, and I should say that the Commonwealth is a group which is of particular interest to me, simply because it's the world in microcosm. It's a third of the world's population, and yet, it's going to be accounting for nearly 50% of the growth in cities to 2050. And that means a doubling of the urban population of the Commonwealth from 1 billion to 2 billion in the next 30 years. So, the scale of the challenge we're facing is really huge. And it's also thrown into relief when you realize that 10% of the population of the Commonwealth account for 50% of its carbon emissions currently. So that's 250 million people account for 50% of the carbon emissions, whereas 90% of the population account for the other 50%. That's 2.25 billion people. And that's the group that are urbanizing rapidly. So, we've got to work really hard to decarbonize our built environment here in the global north, but we've also got to make sure that those in the global south urbanize in a sustainable manner and avoid making the mistakes that we've made, And when you get your head around those numbers, and remember that we're already living beyond our planetary boundaries, there's an awful lot of work to be done. And so the Commonwealth is a great vehicle for doing that. And especially because we can actually get close to leaders who hopefully, can help bring about the changes that we need.
Yeah, that fact that you just shared was absolutely scary when I was reading your report. I was just like quite flabbergasted by it. I mean, it just shows that there's been plenty of criticism, hasn't there, about sort of the West, where we've done what we have done to get to the position that we are, developed, as you want to call it, and there's obviously increasing debate about developing countries and whether they can do what the West has done in the past, whether they should do it, whether they should do it differently. And I think obviously in the best will in the world, they should be doing it differently, not making the same mistakes that the West did to, develop, and there's a better way of doing it. But I think it's also an increasingly tough thing where, you can't just go, don't do this, because you're going to have a bigger carbon footprint. And I think there's a very delicate conversation and balance to all of this, isn't there? Because you can't stop them developing. You want them to develop for the greater good, for their own countries. But at the same time, you want to balance it. And, technology's improved so massively, since the Industrial Revolution time that, there's better ways and better routes to take.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm not comfortable with the them and us any more than I suspect you are. Any more,
I am very much.
Any more than I'm comfortable with the global north and the global south, because I really think we're talking about we're talking about us. We're talking about us as a species and the planet as a whole, and the irony is that when we talk about the developed world, I think we're really talking about the overdeveloped world, because you can't be consuming the equivalent of 3 planets and consider yourself to be developed. I mean, you're basically you're going to break the bank. So we all have to recognize that we need to live within our planetary boundaries, and that's just a simple fact. And actually, I think what we're beginning to see through the kind of green transition is an exciting future, of opportunity. And as you say, leveraging technology, leaving our knowledge and experience in a way that actually can produce a healthier planet and healthier lives, So I think the challenges are enormous, but I don't think it's all doom and gloom, although I do think we have to really put our minds to it.
Yeah, but I think one of the great things, I mean, you've mentioned it in your report, and I'm personally seeing it, coming through with materials development and the R&D sort of side of things, where companies are global in terms of whether they are supplying concrete or bricks or whatever it might be, appliances. And positively, I think the big positive there is that they're changing the way that they're procuring these materials, whether they're recycling or whatever. And that in itself will create a byproduct of wherever that product or material is specified. It's automatically way, way better than what we did 50 years ago.
Exactly.
Where, there's lower carbon footprint, concrete out there now that is available. Yes, it takes a bit longer to set, but it's available. There's timber that is much better sourced with the FSC and the PEFC sort of methodology. VOCs have got way better than, using those chemical-based stuff. And I think all of these things I think we are in a much better place than we were, decades ago.
For sure.
And I think as a byproduct, we won't be making those mistakes anyway, some of them. But I think there are bigger things to do. So it does fill me with some confidence that you're right. It's not doom and gloom, but we still need to make an effort to collectively achieve something.
Yeah, and faster.
And faster, which leads me very nicely to my final question, because I think we can talk about this all the time. But from what you've seen over the decades, from what you've done with the CAA, the RIBA, and other organizations, and this probably is quite a hard question to ask, but what would be one thing that you could do if you could click your fingers and just go, you know what, money was no object. This is the one thing that I would love to implement to tackle climate change?
Well, I'd love to give you a nice pat answer, rather, and of course I can't. But in a way, the answer I think is in the question, because we've got ourselves into this situation partly as a consequence of money, partly as a consequence of the capitalist system, and I think we have to change our method of accounting. We have to change our method of accounting, as we are slowly beginning to do. We have to move from an extractive, exploitative economy to one which is much more regenerative, which respects, the principles of Gaia and Kate's, donut economics kind of principles. So I would want to use whatever money and influence I had to accelerate that transition from an exploitative to a regenerative economy. And, going back to your example of the way in which we can each help in different ways, so, promoting B Corps, promoting, the Global Compact, promoting donut economics, promoting carbon pricing. And because a really insidious thing about capitalism as we currently experience it is we don't price in externalities. So finding a way of pricing in externalities, so we're really paying the true cost of what we're consuming, would be my answer. And, working with policymakers and legislators to accelerate that process, I think is absolutely key. And that really is what COP is trying to do in its essence, I think. It's trying to make us account for the things that we don't currently attribute a value to at the moment, which is effectively the well-being of the planet. So,
absolutely. I really loved what you said about going from an exploitative to a regenerative, because I think that is really only the true way, in one of my opinions, that you're going back to a circular economy. And those circular principles, okay, fine, you might take out something from somewhere, but you're putting it back. And that, probably a decade or so ago, that would be like, oh, let's just plant a tree. But that's not really the essence of it, is it, anymore? No. Really, you've got to really interrogate what you're trying to do. And I think it's taking everyone on that journey, whether it's, you're absolutely right, it's not just architects in a silo, it's the clients, it's the agents, it's the structural engineers. You've got to pull together. Yeah. And one of the things that I think as well, probably in tandem with that, not to do with architecture, but if you look at someone like Polestar as a electric car manufacturer, they've sort of thrown the gauntlet down, and they've now, what I thought was really interesting, I think they're one of the few out there that actually tracked their carbon per car. Mm-hmm. And, obviously they've got their own net zero goals. And I think if you've got companies like Polestar, and there are, I'm sure, definitely many others that are actually making an effort to say, okay, this is what the carbon footprint of each of our cars are. We need cars, we're always going to need cars, that's fine. But, what can we do better? They've stopped using leather. They've, recycled as many of those car parts as possible, and, trying to not use plastics or whatever it might be. So I think if you've got a couple of companies out there that are really pushing, the boundaries, Apple are doing their own things within their sort of technology market, whether you like them or not anyway. But I think all of these things, I think, are moving in the right direction. So it's interesting. I think the conversation's changed. I think the attitude has changed. So it does fill me with some positiveness out there that we are pulling in the right direction. But it certainly feels, certainly from our conversation through your work, that we've still got such a long way to go. But I think hopefully in the right direction.
Well, I think we know what we need to do now. That's the most important thing. And everyone's trying to do their best, and we can all do more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But thank you so much, Peter, for making the time. As I said, I feel we might have to do a part 2 of this, which I hope we can, and sort of delve a little bit further into maybe one particular topic. So thank you so much again for your time. And for everyone who has been listening, this will be the last episode of season 1. We will come back with season 2. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you for being part of this journey. I've been on a big journey myself of learning. And if you have been, thank you so much. And I'll see you in the next one.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.